Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gaddy and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
You know, a church should be where an insecure 16-year-old girl feels welcome and safe. Tragically for some, the church can become a place of great harm. My co-host, Mark M. Bello, has written about this issue in his award-winning novel, Betrayal of Faith, based upon his own experience as a young attorney representing victims of clergy abuse. Our guest today has experienced clergy abuse firsthand. In her own book, Let Me Pray Upon You, Sandy Phillips Kirkham details how a charismatic youth minister preyed upon her, betrayed her in the most vile way, and shattered her faith, leaving her broken and separated from the church she once loved. From the very first meeting, the new youth minister slowly and methodically turned the sacred relationship of a trusted spiritual leader to one of abuse, sexual, emotional, and physical. When his actions were discovered, he was simply moved to another church, leaving Sandy to pay for his deeds. She was not his first victim, nor would she be his last. Sandy moved on with her life, got married, had kids, and successfully concealed her abuse for 27 years. We'll find out why. Her healing process began in 2004 when she decided to seek justice from the pastor in the church. Let Me Pray Upon You details her journey. Sandy, welcome to Justice Counts.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to point out to our listeners is that, yes, these things can happen to your girls too. It's not limited to the Catholic Church and to young male parishioners. These things can happen to young girls as well. And I'd like to get right into it because people do not understand why these crimes go unreported for so long. How did your improper relationship with the pastor begin? And why did you decide to conceal it and conceal the abuse for 27 years before going public?
I was very active in the church. It was a place I loved. I enjoyed being there. I sang in the choir. I taught Sunday school. It was just a place I thoroughly loved being. When I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor, and it was very clear he was different from any youth pastor we'd ever been around. He was young. He was married with 2 kids, but he acted more like our age. He had sideburns, cut off jeans, that kind of thing. And so he was very charismatic and people were just drawn to him. And early on, he tapped into me as to be one of the leaders of the youth group. And I was excited to do that because I saw it as helping the church. It was, and my parents were divorced, so I didn't see my father much. So I really looked to him as a father figure, and I looked up to him. But one night after a youth group meeting at my home, he waited for everyone to leave. He began telling me how wonderful I was and how much he appreciated all the work I'd been doing in the church. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And I was absolutely stunned. I didn't know how to react. And then I began to think I feel guilty for thinking that my pastor would be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. So I just kind of brushed it off that this was his way of showing his affection for me and the appreciation that I had been doing for all the church work. But slowly over a year's time, he began grooming me. He was putting me in leadership positions. He was making me feel good about myself. And it took about that year of grooming me. And sometimes when I was with him, he would hug me. Sometimes he wouldn't. So it never seemed that it was wrong to me. I babysat for his family in the evenings. His wife worked in the evenings. And so that really gave him the perfect opportunity to start taking advantage of me. And that's when one night he just put me on the floor and began undressing me. I was panicked. I was absolutely frozen, actually. I didn't know what to think. I kept thinking he's going to stop. He didn't. Took me up to the bedroom. I remember as he took me into the bedroom, I felt like I was just being led by this person that I couldn't stop. And I remember that the light was on and all I kept thinking was, I hope he turns off the light. And he didn't. And he proceeded to have sex with me on the bed. And from that moment on, the relationship totally changed. And I knew that was wrong. I could no longer justify this kind of behavior. But, he kept reassuring me how much he loved me, how much he needed me, the church needed me, and this was God's will. And that we were now, because of this consummation of our relationship, we were married in God's eyes. All of these things were being told to me by him, and I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, I had just had sex with the pastor in his bed. It was so traumatic for me that I just finally thought, I just have to accept this and figure out how to work through it.
Had you developed some kind of crush on him?
No crush whatsoever. There was never, I looked up to him. I saw myself as someone in the church who'd been taught, to save your virginity for marriage. I wanted to go away to a Bible college. I was really sucked into the church, and there was never an indication. Now, I will say, once he began to having sexual relationship with me, I started to question myself. Did I give him some kind of sign? I didn't mean to. Did I encourage him in some way? So I did begin to feel that guilt, because why would he do this if maybe I hadn't indicated I wanted it? But shortly after the relationship started, he then changed from this caring, wonderful person that I had admired to someone who was physically abusive to me. He was emotionally abusive. And I became trapped. I didn't feel like I had any way out of the relationship.
Scared?
I was very afraid of him. I'd never been hit before. And once you've been hit by someone in the face, they're capable of that at any time. And he always threatened me with things. And one of the things, he always threatened me with was that, if you ever tell anyone, they're never going to believe you, and I'm going to deny it. So, I was afraid to tell anyone. I certainly was afraid of him physically. And so I just began to accept the relationship, that this was what I was supposed to do.
By now that your story is not unique with regard to clergy abuse victims.
Yeah.
It's rather typical. And I certainly don't mean that stories like this are typical in any way. You're unique in being a victim in the first place. But from the standpoint of this small group of clergy abuse victims that you are a part of, the story is remarkably similar to those stories of other people, including boys abused by Catholic priests.
Absolutely. And I find that in my work with victims that there may be differences, obviously, but the similarities are just eerie, and mostly in the way that these perpetrators operate. The grooming, the manipulation, the gaslighting, preying on these victims on the basis that they're the men of God and men of faith and that they're to be trusted. Yes, you're absolutely right. There is a similarity through all of our stories that make it, it's very scary and sad that these men are out there and operating the way they are and using their position as pastors to prey upon women.
The long-term concealment, though, is consistent with stories I've heard from other victims. Let's take your story and broaden it a bit to other people, victims in general. Why do you suppose, in your experience and from talking to others, why do you suppose that long-term concealment seems to be the typical or the norm for clergy abuse victims?
So, and this is a statistic you might be aware of, but the average age for a victim to come forward is 52. I was 49 when I came forward. So it's very common that victims wait so long. For one thing, we want it to be over and we don't want to have to relive it. It's over. I wanted to move on with my life. I was so thankful when it ended that to me, it was like, okay, I'm going to go on to the next chapter of my life. Of course, it doesn't work that way. It's always a part of me. It was always a part of me. And so we're just thankful it's over. Secondly, we're embarrassed. It's not something we want people to know about us. I was thrown out of the church. I was asked to leave the church because of my behavior. So, to allow my friends to know something like that.
But not him. Not him.
Not him.
Even having been involved with it since my 30s, I'm almost 70. I'm still flabbergasted over that fact.
Yeah, he was given a going away party. Moved to the next church. I was called in by the elders shortly after that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I can tell you, I was devastated. I loved that church. It was the only church I'd ever known. And I was being told that I wasn't fit to worship there. And so that fact alone was something else that kept me silent for 27 years. I didn't want people to know that about me. I will also tell you, victims, for me especially, I think, the fear of the consequences if I were to tell anyone. He had drilled that into my head over and over and over. If you tell anyone, you're going to be responsible for what happens. And I certainly then found out what happens when someone did learn. I was the one that was blamed. So that carried over for 27 years.
Well, that's
So
also
those are the,
that's also a little technique that both the church and I use the church as a broad term. Let's call it religious institution. But both the clergy person and the church like to engage in victim shaming, do they not?
absolutely. What did you do to encourage it? And yeah, then the bottom line is, I'm more dispensable than he is. I mean, let's face it. What worth am I to the church? You know, he was very charismatic. He had dynamic sermons. People flocked to this church to hear him. You know, mega churches weren't an in thing at that time, but I can assure you he would have a mega church right now. You know, he took our church from a few hundred to over 1,000 people in a very short time. So in a way, it's easier to blame me than have to deal with the fact that this pastor did what he did. And now, you know, they don't want to lose him and they don't want to lose what they have. So blame the victim.
Yeah. So when you were kicked out of the church, did they do that to you? Did they just blame you and just put it all on you? Is that what happened?
All of it on me.
Yeah.
There wasn't. And let me, in defense of the church, if I can, I was never asked any questions. You know, he was caught. Two people from the church found us in a hotel room. So he was caught. This wasn't a he said, she said. There was no dispute about what happened. But he was called into the elders and given his version of the story. He wrote the narrative. I was never asked any questions. All I was told, I was not to answer questions. I was not to tell my parents. I was not to discuss this with anyone. If anyone asked me any questions, I was to report back to the elders. I was told where to sit in church. So I was constantly being maneuvered around and manipulated in order that they could keep this a secret and move him to the next church. That was the whole goal.
How old were you when he got caught, if you will?
I was 21. So this went on for 5 years. The abuse lasted for 5 years. So yes, and that was the other thing he said to me after it all blew up. He said to me, you've got to tell them that this has only been going on a year. He did that for two reasons. One, of course, he didn't want them to know how old I was when it started. But I also think he knew that if he could pass it off as a mistake and something he didn't mean to do, but it just happened with this 20-year-old for 1 year, you can be forgiven. But to look at them and say, from the very moment I was hired at this church, I have had this relationship with this girl. And he knew that would be harder for them to accept and forgive him for. So if you say, well, it only been going on a year, that's a little more palatable and they could accept that.
My mother told me never to ask a woman her age, but let's assume you're in your 50s.
I'm in my 60s. I have a birthday next month.
Well, you look great. What would you tell your 16-year-old self today? What could you have done differently, and what would you have done back then? And what do you tell victims in general they should do if they find themselves being your 16-year-old self?
Well, I think it's hard to say what you would do with how you would change things because you are who you are at the moment, and you only have the coping skills that you have and the ability to do what you can do in that moment with what you have. I would say trust your gut. You know, there were a couple times prior to his kissing me that I was uncomfortable with his behavior with me. For instance, one time he took me to his basement and said, I want you to listen to this song. And it was Neil Diamond's Brothers Love's Traveling Salvation Show. And he said, what do you think? And I'm thinking, I don't know what to think. This is weird. I've got my pastor in the basement listening to a song. I don't get it. And then he sat down very close to me. And I was very uncomfortable with that. But I didn't want to embarrass him or myself by saying something. So I kept quiet. There were other times when he would say something to me like, are you mad at me because you didn't seem to want to talk to me after church the other day? I'm thinking, well, I just went out to church, but I remember those incidents. So I would say, trust your gut. And if you're uncomfortable, there's a reason you're uncomfortable. I would also be able to say, if I could, stand up for yourself. But the problem with that is, again, he had groomed me and manipulated me to a point that I couldn't have stood up for myself with him. That's part of it. I don't know if I really answered your question, because I think it's a hard question to answer.
Sandy, I'm just wondering if clergy abuse is different from other forms of sexual abuse in other settings. Do you think it is?
I do. And listen, any abuse is horrific and horrible, but when it happens in the context of your faith, it alters who you are, because our faith connects us to people that we have the same beliefs. We share rituals like communion and singing of hymns, prayer. All of those things are now contaminated by the abuse. It touches a sacred part of our soul that we can't get back. I mean, for my spiritual life is forever altered. And I devote a couple chapters in the book. It's called Spiritual Wounds. And I talk about how I don't have that same connection any longer. Prayer is difficult for me. This was a man who prayed on a Sunday morning after he'd had sex with me on a Saturday night, or we had sex inside the church. Those are things that I can't take back and change. And so when I tell people, things that you might find comforting, like prayer and scripture reading, are no longer comforting to victims of clergy abuse. Many victims are no longer believe in a God. I still have a faith in a God, but it's certainly altered and changed from what it was when I was that innocent 16-year-old who was happily serving within the walls of the church.
And, in my book, Betrayal of Faith, I fictionalize this massive cover-up that I felt was happening in the Catholic Church. And I create a secret church division that is specifically tasked with covering up these crimes. Why do religious institutions seem to cover these things up rather than confronting these issues and getting rid of predator priests and ministers?
Well, I think there's two aspects of this. One, they worry about the reputation of the church and what this will do to the reputation. But secondly, I think churches fail to see this as a professional violation. They only see it as a moral violation. So in other words, especially I think in the evangelical church, Christian churches, which is where my abuse happened, there's this idea that, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We shouldn't judge each other. We all deserve, God gives second chances. And so the morality part of it, they deal with without dealing with the professional violation. So they broke the ethics of their profession, but they don't see it that way. They see it as a moral fall. So we should forgive because God forgives us and everyone deserves a second chance. A second chance is just a second chance to reoffend. I also go back to the fact that a lot of these men, women, sometimes women, they don't want to lose this person and they don't want to lose the income that comes in because of this person. And so it's easier to gloss over it. It's easier to excuse it and say, well, God has forgiven us and we're going to forgive him. They believe it. I was told my abuser had changed, that God changes people. Well, he might change people, but that doesn't mean he deserves to be back in the pulpit again. And it's not about whether you forgive them or not. If you want to forgive them, you forgive them. But they deserve that grace and that forgiveness sitting in the third row of the church. Or if they're a pedophile, they don't belong in the church at all. I've been told, well, you shouldn't judge another person. I'm not judging my abuser's soul. I'm not judging whether he's going to heaven or hell. I'm not judging anything about what God believes person he is. I'm judging whether he's capable of doing his job as a pastor. And he's proven by his actions he's not capable of that job. That's what I'm judging.
Well, the other question is he capable of keeping it in his pants?
No.
And the answer to that is historically no.
No.
So why keep somebody like that on?
Especially with his history. Now, I was told when I confronted his supervisor, well, we believe he's a minimal risk. Whose mind does that make sense? What risk do you want in your church at all? A minimal, and how do you determine a minimal risk? I became a victim because when my elders first learned that he'd had an incident in his first church with a young girl who came forward, they said, okay, well, he says he's sorry. He says it'll never happen again. And they let him remain as our youth pastor without giving any information to the congregation. And within 6 months, he was kissing me in my hallway. And that's what happens. And the point is, these churches don't have a right to do that. Churches do not have a right to put another individual at risk because they have determined that he's safe.
Sandy, when did your parents find out that this was going on? Because you mentioned that the elders told you not to tell your parents. You were 21 years old at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't know about any of this?
No, and there was never any suspicion. People have said, well, where were your parents when this was going on this entire 5 years?
Yeah.
I'm in church.
Right.
I'm singing in the choir. I'm making hospital visits with this man. There would have been no reason for them to suspect anything. Of course, this was a time when drugs and, free love was kind of free reign at that point. I mean, they were thrilled to know that I was in church. So when it all came out, two of the elders were aware of it. The elders were aware of it. So I'm sure some of them told their wives. The wives then told their best friend. And as you can imagine, the rumors started going about. And I finally begged the elders and my abuser to say, please let me tell my parents before someone else tells them. And I probably would not have told them if they hadn't given me permission. But because the rumors were starting and people were questioning why he was leaving so suddenly, they then allowed me to tell my parents. Now, let me just say, they also at that point decided, okay, people are questioning things. We're going to have him make a confession to the church. So I was told where to sit in the church. I was told how to react when he got up and spoke. Here's what he said. I come before you as a man with faults. I've sinned against God and I've sinned against my wife. And that was it. That was his confession. 2 days after that confession, he had me meet him in a hotel room.
Not against you.
What did his wife do at this point?
Okay, she had 3 small children. Keep in mind, he was an abuser. And so he was abusive to her emotionally and somewhat physically, probably not as much to her as he was to me. I saw him throw a book at her, hit her in the back of the head. So she is just as much trapped in this relationship and had probably feeling of no way out. She was trying to survive with her family. I will say when he went to the next church, to no one's surprise, he committed sexual misconduct again. She was about 20. She became pregnant. And that's when his wife did decide to leave him.
What did the church do about that situation?
They did remove him then. He was removed. At that point, he was removed from our denomination. I think he operated a gas station for a little while or something. But another denomination, which is similar to ours, Disciples of Christ, hired him. And again, he had incident after incident, not all of them known, but he admitted there were many incidences over the years, mostly adult women. And he continued in ministry till I think one of the husbands of one of the wives sued him. He was then removed from the church. He got counseling for a year, and then he was put back into the church.
So sexually abusing someone is forgiven. Getting someone pregnant is not.
Yeah, and so what happened to the baby?
Well, it's interesting because you know from reading my book, Bob, that I did confront him 27 years later. I hired an investigator.
I
confronted him. I asked about that baby, and he said, well, she kept that baby from me. She got angry at me, and I've never had any contact with the baby, and her husband adopted the baby. And then he finally said, and I'm not comfortable talking about that. Okay, I'm sure you're not.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
Hey, do you know what? I just wonder, we always hear about Catholic church abuse. This happened in an evangelical church, a Protestant church. Is this common, do you think? And if so, why don't we hear about these very much?
It is rampant. I think that the Baptist Church right now, there's a group called Baptist Accountability, and they are exposing. The Christian Chronicle wrote a huge expose on that. Baptist Church is full of, not just the Baptist Church, but they're being exposed right now with the abuses that are occurring in their church. I think the reason you don't hear so much about it is two things. One, unlike the Catholic Church, where it tends to be children, in the evangelicals, it's young teenage girls and young adult women. Secondly, there is no hierarchy in most of these evangelical churches. So, for instance, in my church, there were 10 elders. It was brought to them. They get to make the decision as to how to handle it. So they don't have to go to anybody else. They decide, yes, we're going to move him to the next church and we're kicking Sandy out of the church. End of discussion.
So they're like the board of directors.
Exactly.
Of the company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the cover up is a little bit easier because there is no hierarchy to that. And even when I confronted the president of his denomination with my concerns, the answer I got was, we don't tell our individual churches who they may hire and fire.
What steps did you take to heal? Has religion helped you heal, or has the abuse prevented you from, let's say, reconnecting to your spiritual life?
I wouldn't say it helped me to heal necessarily, but it brought me closer back to my faith than it was before. I had a trigger factor that just sent me over the edge, that forced me after 27 years to finally say, I need to tell someone about this. I need to get help because I'm on the edge here. For 2 weeks, I was totally in a mess. I couldn't function. I remember my husband sat down for dinner and he was reading the newspaper, and I poured him a glass of tea. And then I poured 8 glasses of tea before I realized I had just poured 8 glasses of tea. So I knew that I needed to get help. So the first thing I did was I told someone. And I have to say, to be able to say the words, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor, took me everything I had just to get those words out. I sat and cried for almost 20 minutes before I could say the words. And even then, I remember thinking, at age 49, I'm going to be in trouble if I tell her. I'm going to be in trouble. But I finally got those words out, and her kindness and her understanding was the beginning to let me know it was safe to tell someone. And that started it. And then I began to tell some of my other friends, and I waited to tell my husband. I guess I needed to find out how I felt about what was happening in my life with this and where I was going before I felt comfortable enough to tell him. Even though I knew he would be understanding, I still had that fear. What if he judges me? What if he wonders why I didn't tell him sooner? What if he sees me differently sexually because of this? Those fears that victims feel, they really inhibit our ability to talk about our abuse. And so I told someone. Secondly, I educated myself. I read everything I could on clergy abuse. And so when I began to understand the words grooming and manipulation, it became so clear to me, this is what he had done to me. This wasn't something that just happened to me. This wasn't something that I participated in. I was being groomed and trapped by a predator.
You were also able to find a man, fall in love with him, marry him, have children with him. Did it affect that relationship too, or were you able to move on and have a healthy relationship with a trusting man?
I pretty much had a healthy relationship, only in the sense that keeping that secret affected our relationship. Not that he would see it, but when you try to hide something, it's bound to affect you in different ways throughout your life. We would go to church, and I would get a knot in my stomach every time we passed the pastor's office, and I had to hide that. I couldn't sing the hymns, so I had to act like I was singing when I wasn't. I mean, there were so many things that I had with trigger factors. Mark knows in the book, there was a point where I was in the hotel room. I was supposed to meet him, and I was attacked by a man with a knife. That hotel is in downtown Cincinnati, where we live. I had to pass that hotel every time I would go to my husband's office. All of those things I had to protect 27 years and keep that hidden. Sexually, yeah, I thought about it initially, but my husband was so loving and so kind, and the sex was so different that I didn't equate the two. I mean, my abuser was very aggressive. He was mean. He was verbally abusive during sex. He used all kinds of foreign objects. I don't, not to get, too graphic here, but my husband was so opposite of that I felt it didn't really affect me sexually with him.
Very happy for you.
But that's not the case with a lot of victims. I mean, it's not the case, and I'm very fortunate, and I know that.
Yes, it sure is.
You ever wonder why this happened to you? Why me?
Well, I have, and I looked at the other girls in the youth group, and I think, okay, what was it about me that he picked? Well, number one,
Yeah.
I think I was attractive. Number two, my parents weren't involved in the church, so there was no eyes watching him.
Ah.
Number three, I could pick out the girls and say, okay, Terry, she would have blabbed. There's no way she'd have kept his secret. So-and-so wasn't attractive enough. So-and-so's father was an elder in the church. I mean, and I just had a vulnerability about me that he saw. He just knew that if he worked on me enough, he could get me where he wanted me.
Writing my book, Betrayal of Faith, was a bucket list item for me. I always promised myself I would do it.
Mm-hmm.
And almost 40 years after I resolved the case that I handled, I finally did. What was the book writing process like for you?
Mm-hmm.
Was it difficult? And why did you want to write a book about such a negative experience? Why did you write Let Me Pray Upon You? I love the cover, by the way.
Yeah, and I love the title too. I think it's perfect.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
It probably, I like my title too.
Yeah, it's really
It was
good.
actually, it was the first thing I came up with. I had the title before I ever had the book.
Uh-huh.
But I wrote the book. First of all, I had no intentions of writing a book. I'm not a writer. I jokingly have said my English teacher is turning over in her grave at the thought that I've written a book. But when I was giving my talk I was at speaking engagements, at conferences or in churches, I had so many people walk up to me and say, oh my gosh, your story needs to be told. You need to write a book. It would take me another probably 10 years before I finally felt like, yes, I do need to write a book. And I did that because I was so frustrated by the people who didn't understand the dynamics of clergy abuse. I was frustrated by the media by saying, why do these women wait so long? Or why don't they say no? I thought they don't get it because no one's told them, or they're not listening. And so I felt this need that I needed to educate, but I mainly wrote it because I wanted to tell my story to help other victims. One of the things that kept going over and over in my mind was, what if I'd heard someone else's story of abuse when my own abuse was occurring? Because I can tell you, I thought I was the only one. I thought I got the only bad apple in the barrel. And I think a lot of victims feel that way, that this isn't happening to anyone else. And so I thought I need to share my story so that others can gain some hope and healing from it, and that they're not alone. And, as you said, my story is really not unique, and there are other books out there as well on this, and
Sure.
topics are written about it. But I thought, well, I'll tell my story, and if it helps anyone, then that's what I want to write my story about. It was extremely difficult to write. I had moments when I couldn't write. I wrote every chapter in the book, with the exception of one, which was the chapter, By Their Fruits You Shall Know Them. And that was based, I had an old tape of one of his sermons. It was an old cassette tape. I'd saved it. It was in a box with all my other church papers. And I started to listen to it. It was on marriage and the sanctity of marriage. And I just couldn't do it. I was listening to his voice. I was transformed back to that pew, sitting there listening to him. And so I had a very good friend who was a writer, and I said, here's what I want to take from this message that he was giving, and here's what I want to say. Can you help me write this chapter? And so she did. But the other chapters I wrote myself. It was difficult, but cathartic at times. I tell people, it's one thing to say I was sexually abused. It's another thing to go into detail. It's another thing to talk about the emotions of it and how I felt. And so, yeah, it wasn't an easy book to write, but I'm very glad that I did.
Have you kept up with where he is today? What's he doing?
I have. One of my healing processes required a couple things. One, I wanted to confront him. It was important to me to be able to look him in the eye and say, I know what you did to me and you had no right to do it. I was able to do that. But
you son of a bitch.
Well, I didn't say that, but I made it very clear. I mean, you can read the book as to how that meeting went. I didn't totally let him off the hook, and my husband certainly didn't let him off the hook. The other thing that I did is I contacted his ex-wife because I wanted to not express the fact that I was responsible, but to acknowledge her pain in all of this as well. And we've become great friends. We visited over the years. And so I've kept contact a little bit through him, about him through her. He's still a pastor. He's instilling good standings in the disciples of Christ. I mean, I've gone to his denominational leaders. I've gone to his elders. I've written letters to every pastor in his region about him. Whenever I find out that he's gone to another church to fill in for a pastor or for a vacation, I write that church, and I will tell you the response has always been the same. I'm either ignored, or I'm told that I'm evil, or, well, this happened
What
so long
advice
ago,
would
it
you
has
give
no
to
validity to today.
other people
Those
who
are
are
usually
suffering this
responses
kind of
I get.
situation?
First thing is, you need to understand this is not your fault. There isn't anything you could have done or said that would have changed the situation you're in, because you were manipulated, you were targeted, you were chosen for your vulnerabilities, and you should not feel, we feel so much guilt about being in these relationships when they it's not our guilt to bear. It's any responsibility, and guilt and shame belongs squarely on your abuser, period, end of discussion. Secondly, I would say, educate yourself. It's not until we understand what's been done to us that we can then begin to say, this is how I can work through it and get out of it and heal. And thirdly, and I'm say this from a person who was 27 years silent, you need to tell someone. And that's not easy. And I would suggest going outside of the church, because the very likelihood of telling someone within the church, they're going to have some misplaced sympathies toward that pastor or whatever spiritual leader it is in the church. So finding someone safe to tell is you've got to tell someone, or that your healing is going to be stunted. Or I don't know how you can heal without. If you're keeping the secret, you can't heal.
That's a perfect lead-in to what I'm going to call my final question, and that is, you didn't choose to pursue litigation, either criminal or civil. Would you recommend civil or criminal litigation to a victim? And if not, why not? If so, why so?
I would say you really need to examine your emotional stability, your financial stability, before pursuing any kind of legal action. It's probably difficult to say you can face your abuser, and you never know what the outcome is going to be. So you need to be aware and think about the fact that justice may not come in spite of that. I certainly would never say to someone, you should file a civil suit or legal action. In my case, people I've asked all the time, why isn't he in jail? Age of consent at that time was 16. The statute of limitations prohibited me from filing any kind of legal action. Civil action, I did file in Ohio. There was a statute that came out that said, if you can prove by the preponderance of the evidence that something did occur and there was some abuse by a spiritual leader, you can put his name on a registry. You cannot get money. You cannot, it doesn't have any legal standing, but allows you to at least put his name on a registry. So I did try to do that. But again, I was told, because of the statute of limitations, not the statute of limitations, but because of the age at the time and the no law was broken, I couldn't even get his name on this registry. However, it did force him to retire. When he found out that I was pursuing this legal action, he had retired immediately. And then when the legal action was dismissed, he then was rehired back.
I would suggest to the people who are listening to this that litigation has two potential benefits. One, it makes public the conduct. A court action is typically very public. The media picks up on it pretty quickly, and it does expose his behavior and his conduct, and makes the church in future situations involving this same priest culpable. So it has that advantage. The second advantage is that money is power. And if a church is hit with a big judgment, they're not likely to put up with this kind of behavior in the future if it's going to cost them money. So I would suggest to people that if they aren't faced with a statute of limitations problem, they might want to consider at least civil litigation if they're not willing to press criminal charges. The other thing I would suggest about the statute of limitations is in a lot of these cases, I have found people like Sandy have a tendency to put these incidents out of their mind, something called repressed memory. And years later, the memory comes back, and a lot of legislators have addressed that issue and allowed extensions of statutes of limitation to be extended after memory is recovered. It's not unlimited. There's a limited time period, but especially if it happens to a minor, statutes of limitations
Right.
are extended for minors anyway. But in repressed memory situations, you can get the statute of limitations extended. I just want to say you're very brave for following this up the way you did over the years, and for writing a book like this. And I, for one, think you're a very brave person, and thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
I second that motion. So thank you for being with us today, Sandy, on Justice Counts. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your story with those who are listening.
And, I want to say to victim, there is hope and there is healing. I want to stress that at times it doesn't feel like that's possible. And for me, it was a long time of and going through the pain, the agony, but you can come out on the other side. You're going to take 2 steps forward and 5 steps backward sometimes. But I would recommend, again, finding everything you can about clergy abuse and understand it. And there's many websites, my book has the bibliography in the back. There's just find support groups that you can find on websites. There's SNAP, which is the Survivors Network Against Abusive Priests. I work with the Hope of Survivors Ministry, which you can find online. So I encourage you, and I hope that you can feel that there is some healing possible for each of you.
Get some help if you're struggling
Right.
psychologically or psychiatrically. By all means, get some help. I want to share, Sandy, with you a little tidbit about Hope of Survivors. I reached out to them about Betrayal of Faith, and they took a look at it, and they didn't like my language choices.
Now we're going to take a quick break here, but I'll be back in a sec with some closing remarks. If you check out Mark's books, you'll find out that they're really pretty. They're pretty good. They're very interesting. He's a good writer, and they're all ripped from the headline legal thrillers, and they're all available on Amazon and other major booksellers, online booksellers. Mark's got quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, and you know what? If I was in trouble and I needed a lawyer, that's the guy I'd hire. That's for sure.
Me too. He's much better than I was.
Zachary Blake fights for justice on all fronts. Mark's books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, and the latest is Betrayal at the Border. Now he's about to release a new children's book called Happy Jack, Sad Jack. And another new novel is on the way. It's called You Have a Right to Remain Silent. That's supposed to be out in April. So once again, I want to thank you guys for being with us on Justice Counts. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Mark.